You can have your
Main event of the evening.
ready to race to you.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing Season 9, Episode 14, Grandma Nussbaum.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in Grandma Nussbaum.
We open with the Cunninghams around the piano in the living room, having a sing-along with the returning Uncle Joe.
You know, that song reminds me of the old days of the First World War.
Chachi comes in from having shoveled Howard's walk without asking, and Joni and Narian pressure him into giving Chachi money for it. Howard tries to give him a quarter, then reluctantly gives him $1 instead.
You know, when I was your age, we used to shovel snow and all we got was a quarter.
They had snow back then?
Fonzie enters to take Chachi to go visit Grandma Nussbaum. Chachi doesn't want to go. He loves Grandma Nussbaum, but he's pretty sure that she's not entirely there mentally.
She acts really strange sometimes, you know?
What are you saying?
Fonzie won't hear of it and drags Chachi away. The cousins arrive at their grandmother's apartment. She's happy to see them, especially Fonzie, who she calls Skippy.
Love you too, Skippy.
The following conversation mostly consists of Fonzie saying more and more loudly that they came to see how she was doing, because Grandma Nussbaum keeps forgetting to pick up her hearing aid from the shop.
We just thought we would come by and see how you were doing.
You don't have to yell, I'm not a tree.
She goes to make them sandwiches, despite Fonzie saying they already ate, and Chachi points out Grandma Nussbaum's empty bird cage.
There's no bird.
I can see that. You just keep your voice down.
Why? She can't hear us.
To make matters worse, the sandwiches are peanut butter and relish. Fonzie is annoyed at Chachi for bringing it up, and the younger Fonzarelli goes outside. Fonzie and his grandma talk.
Was Mr. Nussbaum your third husband?
Fourth.
Fourth.
And she recounts how when Fonzie was little, he tried to build a house out of graham crackers, and his friend Dennis ate them, so Fonzie beat him up. Fonzie is impressed that she remembered that, but is less impressed when he has to fake guiding Jojo, the non-existent bird, back into the cage.
Now you stay in your cage and don't you come out again, all right?
After he leaves, Grandma Nussbaum realizes the cage is empty, and wonders if Fonzie is cracking up. Fonzie heads back to the Cunningham house to talk to Uncle Joe about his retirement community. Joe just so happens to have a brochure for Shady Acres with him,
There it is. It's the whole thing for you. Get rid of it yourself.
and Fonzie happily takes it and leaves. The next day at Grandma Nussbaum's apartment, Fonzie and Chachi are about to start packing up her things when the woman herself shows up. Fonzie shows her the brochure
Look at this. Shady Acres, greatest place ever built on loose dirt.
and explains he put a deposit on a room for her. She's offended at the thought that she can't take care of herself anymore, but Fonzie protests that her sight and hearing are deteriorating and she has an imaginary bird. He's wrong about that last one, it turns out. Jojo is in fact real, and he's in his cage.
Look at this. You got an imaginary bird here. Look at this. What is that bird doing in there?
Embarrassed, Fonzie offers to start returning all the pictures he packed, but Grandma Nussbaum says he can keep the one of him as a little boy,
That you can keep.
and sends him away. Back at the Cunningham house, the Cunninghams are playing Twister
Barry, right foot red.
when Fonzie interrupts to talk to Joe. He complains that Grandma Nussbaum is angry at him, and it's Joe's fault for telling him old people like Shady Acres. Joe protests. He said no such thing, just that he likes Shady Acres. Grandma Nussbaum isn't obligated to like it. Fonzie leaves to go apologize as the Cunninghams start playing charades, but not before correctly guessing Marion is trying to act out Bridge on the River Kwai. At Arnold's, Fonzie and Chachi are sadly moping.
You know that name that really embarrasses me so much? What I wouldn't do to hear it one more time.
Skippy.
When Grandma Nussbaum shows up, she gives Fonzie pebbles to put in his boots, and cotton to put in his ears, and her glasses to wear. She instructs him to move around, and Fonzie, naturally, has a hard time of it.
My feet hurt. I can't see too good. I can't hear too good.
Right.
This is life for Grandma Nussbaum, but it doesn't mean she's senile. Fonzie and Chachi apologize, and Grandma Nussbaum admits she's been avoiding wearing her hearing aid and glasses and writing things down because she's been ashamed of getting old.
How can I expect anybody else to have respect for me if I am ashamed of myself?
She and Fonzie embrace, and Fonzie tells Chachi to go see a movie. Grandma Nussbaum hugs Chachi goodbye, and then Fonzie recounts how, when he started living with Grandma Nussbaum after his parents left, one night she stayed late at work, and Fonzie thought she wasn't coming back. Today, he had that feeling again. Grandma Nussbaum embraces him again, and then tries to give him money.
You know what I hope you spend the money on?
No, what, Grandma?
The haircut.
Grandma!
He takes her home.
Thank you, Peter. That was Grandma Nussbaum. It first aired back on January 19th, 1982. Happy Days was followed that night by a new Laverne and Shirley, in which Shirley yells at Rhonda for wearing a fur coat. But then unwittingly goes on a date with a furrier. CBS had a new Simon & Simon, in which a businessman falls to his death after being served papers by Rick and AJ. The businessman's widow then hires the brothers to investigate, and NBC had a new episode of Father Murphy. This week, while Murphy is away from the school temporarily, the kids turn it into a gambling casino. So, Peter, of those three choices, what are you watching?
For the first time, I kind of want to watch Father Murphy. I want to see those kids set up a gambling casino. That sounds amazing.
Father Murphy does sound more fun than usual, but I have to watch Simon and Simon to see that businessman fall out the window.
Oh, that's true. Gosh, this is hard.
Grandma Nussbaum was directed by Jerry Paris, and it was written by the team of Barry O'Brien and James Patrick Dunn. This same team wrote Broadway It's Not back in season 8. This is the last Happy Days script credit for either of them, but they'll both work on Joni Loves Chachi.
Oh, good for you. And how was it?
As for guest stars this week, obviously our main one is Frances Bay as Grandma Nussbaum.
I could make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich just like when you were little.
Frances will make occasional appearances as Grandma Nussbaum for the rest of the series. Frances was a Canadian actress who worked in radio in the 1930s, but didn't start getting TV and film roles until the late 1970s, when she made guest appearances on Kojak, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and Chips, plus the movie Foul Play. She became an in-demand character actress for decades after that. She was a particular favorite of director David Lynch, who cast her in Blue Velvet.
I don't see how they could do that. I could never eat a bug.
Wild at Heart, and Twin Peaks, Seinfeld fans will instantly recognize her as the woman whose marble rye gets stolen by Jerry.
You're not getting this right.
All right. All right.
Frances also played Adam Sandler's grandmother in Happy Gilmore. Toward the end of her life, Frances had a recurring role as Aunt Ginny on The Middle. She died at the age of 92 in 2011. Peter, what did you think of Frances Bay as Grandma Nussbaum?
She was absolutely wonderful. She's terrific in the role. The thing about this episode is that it's mostly about how her behavior can be interpreted, and I think she does a good job at not overplaying anything. So you can understand where Fonzie and Chachi are coming from, but you also do get the sense that, yeah, she actually does have a good head on her shoulders, and she's not losing her mental faculties yet. And she and Henry Winkler have very good grandmother-grandson chemistry, too. So that was great.
I have admired Frances's work in film and television for years, and it was wonderful to have her on this show. And she has the assignment here of playing a character who is slightly dotty in a sitcom kind of way, but also has to seem believable as a real human being with feelings and emotions. And Frances Bay is able to convey all of that. I'm so glad she's here. And I'm glad that she'll be with the show off and on for the rest of the run. By the way, Lillian Bronson, the actress who previously played Grandma Nussbaum,
I like your place, Skippy.
was still alive in 1982, but she had retired from acting. Nothing bad happened to Lillian Bronson. She was fine.
And we're very glad for that.
Yes. And Pat O'Brien returns for the second and final time as Uncle Joe.
I don't know what Mrs. Belsey told you, but there were no promises of marriage.
As we mentioned in our review of the Roaring Twenties, Pat was a well-known film star of the 1930s and 40s who was in such classics as Angels with Dirty Faces, Knute Rockne All-American, The Front Page, and much more. Pat moved to TV in the 1950s and stayed there for the rest of his career. This episode of Happy Days was his final acting role. He died in 1983 at the age of 83. Peter, what did you think of Pat O'Brien as Uncle Joe?
He was delightful. He's very much only a supporting character, but he's very fun. He's spiking his coffee. He's calling out directions for Twister. He's interrupting sing-alongs to tell stories that are only tangentially relevant. I love him.
Pat O'Brien obviously loved to act and he loved to perform. He called himself a ham in interviews. So it's great to see him on this show doing what he loves, which is acting. And Happy Days gave him the very last opportunity of his life to do what he loved. As for songs this week, despite this episode being written by James Patrick Dunn, there are almost no songs in it. All we get is Polly Wolly Doodle, performed by
Tom Bosley, Marion Ross, Aaron Moran, Linda Goodfriend, Pat O'Brien, and Ted McGinley.
This is a children's song that goes back to the days of minstrel shows. It was first performed by Dan Emmett's Virginia Minstrels in 1843. Emmett is sometimes credited as the composer. Polly Wolly Doodle later became popular with Ivy League glee clubs and has been covered by Shirley Temple, Alvin and the Chipmunks, Burl Ives, and more.
Hey, Simpson, what are you trying to play?
Polly Wolly Doodle.
Oh, yeah? Well, it sounds Polly Wolly crappy.
Peter, was Polly Wolly Doodle a song that you grew up with?
When I was a kid, we had a bunch of VHS tapes that were sing-alongs. Like, there was one that was Christmas songs with clips from old Disney animation, and there was one that was set at a circus, and all of the songs were really old public domain songs, and one of them was Polly Wolly Doodle.
So it was a part of your childhood. Were you aware of its minstrel show origins?
Not at the time. It doesn't surprise me, but it does make me sad. Why do so many songs that are considered part of the American canon from minstrel shows? That's a rhetorical question. I know the answer is because America is founded on racism.
My main association with Polly Wolly Doodle is when I was growing up, there was a kid who lived around the corner from us named Scott, and he told me one day that he hated being called Scotty Waddy Doodle all day, and apparently somebody in his life was calling him that. and of course, as soon as he told me that, I called him Scotty Waddy Doodle all day every opportunity I got. So,
gosh.
As for cultural and historical references, Uncle Joe says he flew with Eddie Rickenbacker during World War I.
That's right, Eddie Rickenbacker. We were shot down back of the enemy lines.
No kidding. Were you badly hurt?
No, not really. I fell on Eddie.
Edward Vernon Rickenbacker, also known as Fast Eddie, was a real-life fighter pilot from Ohio who served in the U.S. Army Air Service from 1917 to 1919 and became America's most successful and decorated flying ace. If Joe served with Eddie, it was likely as a member of the famed 94th Aero Squadron. Was Eddie Rickenbacker a name that you recognized from your history classes at all?
My history classes were not great.
But you did know the name Eddie Rickenbacker from the past?
Yes.
Chachi says of Grandma Nussbaum, one of her Twinkies is missing.
I think one of her Twinkies is missing.
These famous snack cakes were invented by a Canadian named James Dewar in 1930. He was a plant manager for the Continental Baking Company when he got the idea to manufacture shortcakes with cream on the inside. Continental was later acquired by Hostess, where James Dewar rose to the rank of vice president. He retired in 1972 and died at the age of 88 in 1985. So Twinkies are Canadian. That kind of shocked me. We are told that Grandma Nussbaum used to read Hansel and Gretel to Fonzie when he was a child.
You used to read to me from this red book, you know, Hansel and Gretel. Remember that?
I must have read that to you 100 times.
Yeah.
Causing Fonzie to build his own gingerbread house out of graham crackers. First published in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm, Hansel and Gretel is a famous German folktale about a brother and sister abandoned in the woods by their poverty-stricken father at the behest of his second wife. The children are lured into a cottage made of gingerbread by a witch who plans to cook and eat them, but then the children outsmart the witch and manage to kill her in her own oven before reuniting with their father.
I wonder if the reason why little Fonzie liked that story so much was because he'd just been abandoned by his own parents. Maybe he could relate to Hansel and Gretel.
He absolutely could. Fonzie plans to send Grandma Nussbaum to a retirement home called Shady Acres. There are numerous fictional retirement homes with this name, including ones in South Park and Thor Ragnarok. By an astounding coincidence, Francis Bay's character in Happy Gilmore is actually sent to a place called Silver Acres.
Hey, look at this place. Silver Acres Rest Home. Hell, it looks more like a country club than a nursing home.
The one on the Golden Girls was Shady Pines.
Come on out to the Lanai, I'll give you the lowdown on Shady Pines. You know, who does what for cigarettes?
Fonzie says that Shady Acres offers mahjong, but he doesn't know what that is. He could ask Marion, since she's a devoted mahjong player. For the record, it's a tabletop game played with tiles. It dates back to 17th century China, but Jewish American women developed their own version of the game in the 20th century. Gary Marshall once planned to do an entire sitcom called Wives about married women who gather to play mahjong in a restaurant. The cast would have included Penny Marshall as one of the wives and Pat Morita as the owner of the restaurant. And Pat's character basically evolved into Arnold on Happy Days.
Oh, wow.
The Cunninghams play a spirited round of Twister.
Oh, isn't this fun, Uncle Joe? You know, I'm going to challenge Chachi to a game.
Over my dead body.
This famous party game was introduced by Milton Bradley just in time for Christmas 1966, so it's a little anachronistic for this episode.
Bradley's got a deaf one. It's a Twister. 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 All the girls and homeboys playing Twister. 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 Twister.
Peter, do people even play Twister anymore? I cannot imagine anyone playing this game post-COVID in 2022. What do you think?
Look, even before COVID, Twister never looked like a fun game to me. Maybe that's just because one of my first exposures to it was in Austin Powers, where the joke is that you think that Austin and Vanessa are having sex, but actually they're just playing Twister.
Right hand's green.
So, like, no, I don't want to do that with people I am related to. That makes me uncomfortable.
The Cunninghams play charades, a classic French parlor game that dates back to the early 1800s. Specifically, they're playing acted charades, in which players physically act out the clues. There was actually an earlier version of charades in which players try to decipher written clues. Does that sound fun?
I guess. In the right circumstance.
Have you ever played charades, the acted out charades?
A few times, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's okay. It's mildly fun. There's a great Carol Burnett show sketch about charades, so look that up on YouTube.
Come on, Mama. Okay, it's a bug. Mama, no. It is so.
One of the incorrect guesses during charades is Row, Row, Row Your Boat.
Row, row, row your boat.
A popular English children's song that dates back to at least the 1850s. And I am still envious of this one tweet I saw where someone said that Row, Row, Row Your Boat has the greatest plot twist in the history of songs.
Yes, because you think it's just a song about rowing a boat, and then it hits you with life is just a dream. Nothing is real.
Another guess is Easter Parade.
Easter parade!
Since the category is films, I'll assume this is a reference to the lavish 1948 musical with Fred Astaire, Judy Garland, Peter Lawford, and Ann Miller. And that film still plays every year on television around Easter. Yet another guess is Kid Dynamite.
Kid Dynamite.
The East Side Kids made a movie by this title in 1943. Leo Gorcey, Hunts Hall, Bobby Jordan, Gabriel Dell, and Ernest Morrison, a.k.a. Sunshine Sammy, were all in it. Fonzie correctly guesses Bridge on the River Kwai.
Bridge on the River Kwai.
No! Yeah!
This is the classic 1957 war film directed by David Lean and starring William Holden and Alec Guinness. The ending of the film involves Guinness's character, a British military officer in World War II, blowing up a newly constructed bridge in Thailand.
Who here likes a good story about a bridge?
Fonzie tells Chachi to go see Psycho again.
Hey, Chachi, you want to see Psycho again? Sure. Go ahead.
I guess Joni and Chachi ignored Al's advice in Hello, Mrs. Arcola and saw the film anyway. Again, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho came out in 1960, so it would have been a couple of years old by the time of this story. Then again, there was no home video or streaming in the early 60s, so theaters would occasionally book older films. It's not impossible that Psycho would still be playing in 1962.
For once, the time stream has not been irrevocably damaged.
Other observations this week, we keep hearing about how Fonzie was raised by Grandma Nussbaum for 10 years.
I lived with her for 10 years. It's my fault.
But which 10 years were these specifically? Fonzie's mother abandoned him when he was 4, so did he move out on his own at age 14? What do you think, Peter?
I guess. Fonzie's not been very consistent about when each of his parents left, when he lived with Grandma Nussbaum, how long it was for. I think it's best to say take everything Fonzie says with a grain of salt, or assume that the basics are correct, but the details might be spotty, because Fonzie is very melodramatic, and he likes to emphasize certain things in order to make himself sound more impressive.
It's nice that the writers remembered that Grandma Nussbaum's nickname for Fonzie was Skippy. That became a common nickname for young boys due to a popular comic strip called Skippy that ran from 1923 to 1945. Now, I don't understand how Fonzie's family tree works at all. Are Grandma Nussbaum and Louisa Arcola related, or is Grandma Nussbaum related to Chachi's deceased father? Who's related to whom here?
I assumed that Louisa is a Fonzarelli. I assume Fonzarelli is her maiden name, so I'm assuming that she's Louisa's mom.
So Louisa never visits Grandma Nussbaum?
Maybe she doesn't have a great relationship with her mom. Some people don't.
Grandma Nussbaum seems nice. Go visit her. And I managed to find a few photos of Henry Winkler as a child, but none of them look like that picture that we see at the end of this episode, so I don't know who that kid is. What did you think of that picture, by the way?
It was cute.
It's a cute picture of a kid, but I don't think it's Henry Winkler. And if Henry Winkler's emotions seem genuine in that final scene, it's because they were. According to Francis Bay, Henry's real grandmother died in the Holocaust, so he treated Frances as an honorary grandmother.
Oh.
So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in this episode?
In the second scene in Grandma Nussbaum's apartment, she comes back from the store wearing a scarf over her head, like a babushka or something. That tickled me. That tickled me a lot.
I think some people actually affect a little old lady style of fashion. And if they do, Grandma Nussbaum could be somebody that they turn to for inspiration, because she's certainly the iconic little old lady in the way she dresses.
It's the little old lady from Pasadena.
So, Peter, I will ask that age-old timeless question, was this episode any good?
Yeah, this is a really fun, enjoyable episode. I think it does a really good job at balancing emotion with lighter aspects. It's a great showcase for Henry Winkler, and it's a great showcase for Francis Bay, too.
This is a very sweet and heartwarming episode, and it feels really heartfelt on the part of both the actors and the writers. You really get to see Fonzie's vulnerability in a story like this, because he's genuinely concerned about Grandma Nussbaum's health and welfare and well-being, and he makes this move that she finds insulting. thing. And then when he thinks he's damaged that relationship, of course, he is devastated. So yeah, this was a very, very nice episode. The only aspect of this episode that I didn't like was that Chachi was such a jerk in the opening scenes. I really didn't like the way that Chachi was talking about Grandma Nussbaum or acting around Grandma Nussbaum.
Are you really surprised that Chachi is a jerk? At this point, it kind of goes without saying. That's just how he is. Chachi ruins everything.
I was really irritated with him in the early scenes of this episode. I didn't like him bad-mouthing Grandma Nussbaum behind her back, and that bothered me, but the rest of the episode is very, very sweet and very nice and very touching. So I would highly recommend Grandma Nussbaum. So, Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things we are doing?
Listeners can follow us on Twitter at Fonzie Podcast. They can follow me on Twitter at Peter Volfranc. That's PeterVulfranc.
And they can follow me on Twitter at Joe_A_Blevins. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysareours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysareuspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, Al gets put in charge of a big Leopard Lodge event when he says he can get Frankie Avalon to perform in Pooh-Bah Doodah.
Sounds like Marsha Brady and Davy Jones all over again. So see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
Twister! Milton Bradley has a new one. It's a Twister. Gets you all twisted and tangled. It's a Twister. Spin the spinner and call the shop. Twister ties you up in a knot. That's Twister. Yeah, Twister.
Right foot blue.
Right foot blue.
Left hand red.
Left hand red.
Left.
Right.
Yellow.
Blue.
Green.
Yeah, Twister. You gotta play Twister in your stocking feet. Standing on this crazy colored sheet. That's Twister. Yeah, Twister. Who makes the best games in the world?
Bill Twister. I'm Twister Bradley. Oh.
You gotta get it. Get Twister.
From MB.
You don't have to yell, I'm not a tree.